Hello everyone, my name is Kayo Namaizawa and
My name is Miru Oki.
we are administrative staff of Self-Access Learning Center at Kanda University of International Studies. Today we are going to talk about supporting learners via social media amid the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, the coronavirus spread all over the world and it affected us. All classes were conducted online and students were not allowed to enter the campus at all. However, we wanted to keep providing learning opportunities. Then, we came up with ideas to use SNS more for supporting learners by collaborating with not only teachers but also student staff. First of all, let me introduce a brief history of SALC SNS. In 2009, we started using Twitter. At that time, SALC Twitter was run by teachers. In 2011, we started using Facebook, but because of declining of its popularity in Japan, we are no longer using it. But the account is still activated, so if you would like to see our old posts, please check our Facebook account. In 2017, we started using Instagram. In 2019, we, administrative staff, started to collaborate with Teachers SNS Committee. In 2020, we started using YouTube, and also student staff SNS team was created by student staff. Currently, we are using 3 SNS, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube as our official SNS. Due to online classes, SNS became one of main tools to connect students with us. Also, we predicted many students would spend more time on SNS than usual because of the state of emergency. In fact, we got more followers compared with last year, and the result of the survey we conducted at the end of the semester shows it is true. Therefore, we decided to use YouTube as well to emphasize on using SNS to support students. In this presentation, we will introduce the support we have been provided with 3 important keywords: connection, support, and cooperation. The first keyword is connection. As we mentioned in the introduction, we predicted that most of the students were at home and they would spend more time on SNS than usual because of the state of emergency. Also, we mentioned that we have Twitter account and Instagram account. Both SNS have their strongest points. Therefore, we decided to utilize features of each SNS functions and connect with them. The strongest point of the SALC Twitter has more followers than other SNS. It means there is a possibility that many students will see our contents. For example, we introduced our Twitter account on Instagram, where we set the Twitter setting be tweeted to be tweeted automatically when we post something on Instagram to advertise the SALC and SNS. Also, Twitter can announce the information quickly and timely. We post short sentences about the latest information about the SALC on Twitter. The strongest point of Instagram is we can decorate images as we like. It means we can make advertisement of our services more attractive and make students feel closer to us. For Instagram, we post photos or images mainly and short movies by using stories function. Also, we communicated with users by using questions functions or quizzes function on stories of Instagram. YouTube is available to post a long video. So we posted the long video and put subtitles on it so that everyone can understand more detailed contents. To post content more effectively, we adjusted and decided the schedule to post contents. We sometimes post the same information on each SNS, but we make changes on the content of writings and we try not to update each SNS at the same time. In order to do so, we tried to update each SNS frequently. Students can get the same information even if they use different SNS, and it increases the opportunities to catch students' eye.
The second keyword is support. In our university, there are various kinds of students. So we wanted to answer the needs of those students. So we provided four kinds of support by creating a variety of contents. The first support is support for self-learning. We created contents, introduced online resources via Twitter, and made posts which students can learn vocabularies or idioms from them on Instagram. Also, we posted comics which were illustrated by one of the teachers and introduced how to use vocabularies or idioms we posted in the past. The second keyword is support for various levels students. We are using English for our contents of SNS, but as we mentioned earlier, there are various English levels students. So we decided to use subtitles for YouTube videos and post translations of comics on Instagram so that all students can study by themselves by using SNS. The third keyword is support for SALC users. We hold some online events almost every month, so we advertised those events on SNS or introduced SALC online services. The final support is support for student mental. We wanted students to feel connections between them, the SALC, and other users. So we frequently updated communicative contents on Instagram, especially by using the stories function. Through these supports, we wanted students to use our SNS as through they are in the SALC. The third keyword is cooperation. For creating SNS contents, three kinds of people are involved with: student staff, teachers, and administrative staff. All members are generating ideas for contents, but also we support each other by using our strengths. For example, the student staff is the students, so they can create the contents from student viewpoints. Teachers are checking English grammar of each content, and they can create the contents which are related to study. Administrative staff support more technical parts, such as creating images and use SNS function more effectively, and providing a platform for making contents. Also, administrative staff connects with teachers and student staff, adjust a schedule for posting them on Instagram. These corporations made it possible to create various kinds of contents and high quality contents. So let me show some example of connection. So first example is a project which was made by student staff. So first, the idea of interviewing teachers came up from student staff at a project meeting. And they decided to interview one of the teachers. So they discussed interview questions or a timeline for the interview and creating a post for SNS. Then after the interview, they created contents. Then they hold a meeting to revise contents, and they invited a teacher from social media committee to ask for feedback from teachers' point of view. So another example is comics which were drawn by a teacher. So a member of teachers' social media committee draw comics in English for Instagram. Then administrative staff translates them to Japanese so that everyone can understand. So these are examples of connection, a cooperation. Like these examples, we are cooperating each other in order to make better contents for our SNS. So in conclusion, we have introduced our activities to support students via SNS by using three important keywords: connection, support, and cooperation. And it is developing now. However, we found that the only one keyword does not work effectively. SALC SNS work more effectively when all three keywords connected. We don't know how long this situation will last, but we hope students can find their own way of learning via our SNS and enjoy learning. We have just started to run this system this academic year. It has been working well so far, so we would like to continue working with this style from now on. Thank you for listening. Thank
Thank
you.
you.